Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston, and this is an interactive experience. Before we launch into our topics this week, we want to hear from you. Podcasts at the1916company.com. Send us your questions because we have answers. In fact, that is exactly how we were going to open today, and we're going to start with a question submitted by Mr. J. Sharp. Armand, how do companies view second-hand purchasers? Are they happy when a watch is removed from the market because it improves retail sales by reducing supply? That is the question from Jay Sharp. How do companies view second-hand purchasers?
You know, I think that very much depends on the company themselves. I'll say, and I'd love your feedback on this, I'll say far and wide, brands don't pay attention to their own secondary market. I think over the past 10 years, a handful of brands have started to get a little bit more interested in the secondary market as it has expanded and as it has gotten more interesting to collectors. But I think far and away, brands turn a blind eye towards secondary market, and it is a very short-sighted thing.
Well, I think they have like a love-hate relationship with it. Let's take a good example, which is the auction circuit. That's a secondary purchase. And I think every brand loves to be on the cover of an auction catalog or to make mainstream media headlines for some ridiculous auction yield on an old watch. I do think that when they think of the secondary market, they think of the good, which could be, record auction results or new people discovering the brand, maybe starting with a pre-owned watch and then visiting a boutique or an authorized dealer. And I think there's the other side, which is maybe the seedier side, which, sometimes drags down the secondary image, which is the flipper, the fly-by-night guy, the vendor that's just an eBay handle and doesn't have a physical store or website or skin in the game, watches that are in bad condition or not properly serviced. So I think what you're seeing now is a gradual embrace of the high end of the pre-owned.
I think another good example of that is a brand like Patek as well. I think their commitment to servicing any watch they've ever produced really says something for their care in the secondary market, interest in the secondary market, because quite honestly, you're not going to have an original owner watch from 1930.
That's a really good point, because I think at the end of the day, the watches that outlive their owners still have a lot of value, even maybe more than some of the more recent pieces, because they tell a long-standing story, and longevity is probably the number one selling point that Swiss watch brands try to convey to us. Tying yourself to like a long-standing heritage is definitely the favorite thing their marketing departments do, alongside sponsoring race cars and golf tournaments. So yeah, again, just a nod towards pre-owned and heritage being sort of two different threads of the same idea. You can't have heritage without pre-owned.
That's actually a really, really interesting point. And I think there is a bit of a distinction between heritage or, true vintage and pre-owned. I think largely consumers will look at pre-owned as more contemporary and vintage as something that is separate from pre-owned, when in fact they are one and the same to a certain degree.
Yeah, definitely. You never truly own a Patek Philippe. And, it's always implied that the kid in the picture is the guy's son, but, it could be like a friend of the family or a nephew, or a mentor situation. Like
a boy ward.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to keep this on the light side of the force, Armand. But, it's the kind of thing where that's definitely part of their image, and that's part of what they're selling, and that's part of the value in the watch, that it does have enduring qualities. I've seen brands, attempt at various levels to embrace certified pre-owned. Vacheron has Les Collectionneurs, where you have restored significant pieces from their history available through the dealer. Jaeger-LeCoultre does the same thing in its own way. And we've seen small brands like FP Journe with the Patrimony, and De Bethune was even dabbling in De Bethune pre-owned. There's an appeal there. I think the one common thread through all of the brands that have embraced this is that they want to do it in low volume in a highly curated fashion on their terms.
You nailed it with volume. With De Bethune creating roughly a total of 3,000 watches in their production in general. That's
since 2002,
since
folks.
2002, yeah. That is a little bit easier of a mound to tackle than the millions and millions of other pieces that may be out there from various other brands, even in the last, to give it the De Bethune timeline, the last 22 years.
And I think there's another side of this too. There's definitely a desire to prevent watches from becoming ballast on the aftermarket, for want of a better term, a presence that devalues the brand by selling for below market prices and being too available. That's why you've seen, particularly from Cartier and some high-end Richemont brands, buying up and destroying excess inventory. And this was a problem a couple of years ago when everything from tax laws to gifting standards changed in East Asian markets. Suddenly there were a lot of watches floating around, so watches were bought up and destroyed. And Ulysse Nardin recently did the same thing. We talked in one of our recent podcasts about this, so I won't get too deep into it. But basically, you don't want too many old watches floating around. You don't want too many recent used watches floating around because it creates the impression that these things aren't finding owners and that they go from the authorized dealer to the gray market dealer to Chrono 24. That hurts the image. But I think if you can keep it upscale, constrained supply, and as the factory in some way benefit either in image or in sales from pre-owned, there's a qualified embrace of it now, which is much different from where we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they wanted nothing to do with pre-owned. 10 years before that, they would claim that every watch sold on the internet was counterfeit. And most of the watch brands didn't even have a decent website. So they're being dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world, but again, on their terms to the extent that they embrace it. All right. We have another question from Watchalist, who asks, what are your ultimate collections? And I'm just going to preface this, Watchalist, if you're out there listening, we're going to hold this to no more than 5 watches. That's a maximum, not a minimum, because we could literally go forever. This would never end. This would be like the 24 hours of Le Mans.
I had a lot of fun with this list too. You know, it was actually a little bit more difficult than I expected it to be. I feel like I hold certain pieces in regard in a back pocket in my brain that is a separate folder of reasonability and a separate folder of what is reality.
Okay.
So, you know, I have to say I went with, you know, specific pieces. My first pick for this is a possible piece unique 5970 1J with a black dial. I don't know that it's a piece unique. I've only seen one, and the one that I've seen, I believe, was sold by Bob Marin at one point.
That's a really interesting one right there because it's pretty close to something I have on my list. I have a 5070J on my list.
5070 is one of my absolute favorite Pateks. The yellow gold version in particular, it's a perfect watch to me.
That's a really cool piece. I would say if you can get a black dial, yellow gold perpetual calendar chronograph in 40 millimeters, definitely go for it. If that opportunity arises, it may not come again. So again, this is a dream watch collection. So yeah, let's go with that. Run with it, Armand. What else is on the list?
So next one, I was having a tough time choosing between 2 Debatunes. The DB28 Grand Sport is ultimately my pick. It is a titanium piece, and it kind of represents a bit of a transitionary period from Debatune going into, I guess it was, among the first DB28s, actually. There is a California limited edition that's very cool. There's a blued version that's very cool, but my favorite version is just the straight titanium. There's one large blue hour hand. It's very evocative of Debatune in its case, but it also has some early DB in its movement design.
All right. Well, I'm going to launch with a watch that is not all that mega. The Ball Engineer 2 Magneto S. It was made briefly, and it was spectacular. A 42 millimeter stainless steel watch. It's 100 meters, chronometer certified. It has a Mu Metal shield that works like the iris from Stargate, if you're familiar with that.
Very familiar with the iris in Stargate.
So this is the coolest thing on earth. You can literally shield your movement by turning the bezel. This iris expands and compresses over the movement to shield it. And then you turn the bezel in the other direction and the iris disappears to the periphery of the case. And it gives you 80,000 ampere per meter shielding, which is mil-Gauss, roughly speaking. And so you get a lot of anti-magnetism, you get the water resistance, you get the chronometer certification. It also has spring lock, which is another Ball technology. It's basically a cage around the hairspring that prevents shocks from greatly displacing it. So this has 2 advantages. One, It's going to protect the hairspring from potentially moving to the extent that it gets damaged and deformed, but it's also going to keep it relatively in plane because it's really like a pizza box that goes around the hairspring. It's broad and narrow, so it prevents it from jumping up and down. And that will improve the timekeeping even during brutal beatdown sessions, like things that are highly cyclical and high impact. Think cross-country mountain biking where the hits just keep coming bam, 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 bam. Spring lock is designed for situations like that. And for something that is very simple to implement in terms of packaging, the actual difference it makes is huge. So I would be all over this roughly $2,000 to $3,000 watch. It's not rare because it was a limited edition. It's rare because they didn't make a lot of them and they didn't make it for long. It also has one of the few active lume systems you'll find on a modern watch where tritium tracers, little gas-filled glass capsules, are used as the indices on the dial and the lume on the hands. So you can put it in a dive locker if you wish for 6 months, pull it out in the middle of the night, and it's still glowing, which I think is really cool. And no, it's not going to irradiate you, but it is kind of cool thinking that you've got a radioactive, self-activating luminescent watch. Cool piece, hard to find. I will own it someday.
This watch is awesome. Honestly, this is one of the reasons why I like sitting down with you, Tim, because I've known about this watch only through you, only ever through you. But it's one that is fun to remember. I'll put it that way, because there's so much going on. There's so many pieces. The iris is one of those things that is, there's an argument that it's useless, and it's one of the most remarkable things that is such a cool little complication, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, for a watch that's got a very basic 2824 movement, again, chronometer certified, they managed to pack a lot of unique features and value into this, proving once again that once you reach a certain standard of accuracy and reliability, it's not all about the movement. And this watch is a great example of that.
And it's just something that nobody does or has ever done. It's like that. That is so cool. Good, really solid pick.
Another watch is similar to what you've got on your list. I have the 5070J. This is the original version of the watch that came out in 1998. It was made for 4 model years, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, before the white gold model supplanted it. There's something about the combination of the black dial and the yellow gold. This is the only yellow gold watch that I actually want to own. Nowhere else on my list is there anything that's even colored gold. I don't like rose, I don't like yellow, but the watch looks the most like the 2512 prototype that inspired it of all the 5070 variants, and it just sizzles with that yellow printed black dial, the yellow gold case, so much presence, 42 millimeters. What a monster when it came out in 1998, that this was going to be a Patek Philippe dress watch back when most of their dress watches were 33 to 36 millimeters. What an outlier. And as a result, how well has it stood the test of time?
Remarkably. I mean, the case itself is actually, you can draw lines directly to modern Patek case designs. Look at the 5172, for example. You don't have the stepped bezel, but you do have the stepped lugs that are, kind of came from, I guess, 5235 type of case design. But that case is special. It's different. It's interesting. The movement doesn't quite fit into it, but in this case, it's romantic for some reason. There's something to be said about the gilt markers that you mentioned on the dial. It's very evocative of a vintage timepiece in a neo-vintage time period.
Yeah, a watch that's pretty much got everything going on, and that in spite of the fact that there's a huge disparity between movement and case size, and they use every kind of trick of the eye on the case and the bezel and the dial to disguise that. And I would say it's more beautiful for the flaw because the corrections that are implemented are all so successful. It's one of those things you notice when it's mentioned, but you don't if it isn't. It's just a really well-designed watch and a case study in how to design a watch geometrically around the limits of the movement size. So that's kind of where I'm standing there. Well, keep going. What's on your list?
All right. So, I wrote down a note, any Cartier with Panther decor, and specifically their I don't know what Cartier I can't pull it right now, but effectively they're rare handcraft Panther decor. You know, something. I mean, if we're going piece unique, a Cartier crash with Panther decor, but the 2017 Cartier Drive in gold with the micro Panther sculpture on it is one of my favorites. I think it's very cool. I like cats a lot, and I like Cartier. And to borrow a phrase from a friend of mine at a brand, Cartier is are friends with the cats, and that is something that's really cool to me. I just like it as a design. I like that it is kind of the rare handcraft end of things, and it's just fun.
You know, I was at SIHH in 2018, and I remember they had the ultimate Panther watch. It was the Cartier Révélation de Panthère, and it didn't look like anything until you started, I guess, wrangling it. And it had these beads that would fall almost like an hourglass, but there were interior profiles of the sapphire that would cause the beads to travel through channels that created the impression of a panther's head. And so the beads would pass through those channels, fill the space. You'd see the panther for a fleeting moment, and as the beads passed through the hollows, it would disappear. Probably the coolest implementation of the theme I've ever seen. It was very expensive. I've never seen one outside of a watch show. But what a cool idea, and how well was that implemented?
And those beads were suspended in oil of some sort, is that right?
I believe it was oil, and I guess we can add that to the list of oil-filled watches.
Technically.
Along with Resonance and the Zinn UX, and the Bell & Ross is made by Zinn. So, yeah, a very cool idea. Not a watch that's mechanically interesting, but a watch that is very interesting. All the same. Again, guys, it's not always about the movement.
Sometimes it's about fun.
That is a very true fact. Okay, so for me, Debatoon DBD, they made 39 of them back in 2006. Debatoon brought the watch back in 2 different editions for 2023, and they wound up making, I believe, 33 more. So it's going to be a watch destined for rarity. This is a tombstone-shaped watch that has a jump hour and an inline simple calendar. The original version also had a moon phase on the case back. The new one has a display case back. I've always loved this watch, and I was shocked when they brought it back because for something that was obscure and a marginal sales success in its day, you just don't expect that nearly 20 years later, that's going to be fast-tracked for a re-edition. So I love the fact that Debatoon did it because it proves that they are really in touch with their history and what enthusiasts of their history think is important. And I also love the fact that the new version of the watch is actually more wearable. You know, they decided that they were going to do this with 2 different case materials, polished titanium and almost scratch-proof black and zirconium. The originals were all precious metals, so they were delicate things. The new one, a hell of a lot hardier, sturdier, and designed for everyday use. And Kasim Dean, Swizz Beatz, the American recording artist, he was actually overseeing the first of those 2 editions, 13 pieces with black zirconium case and a burgundy dial. Oh my gosh.
Very good looking.
That was just like a stroke of genius. They're all gone. They're all sold out. Then came the titanium polished case with the evergreen dial. Those 2 are all sold out, and they're in the multi-year process of building out what was ordered. But either the new one from 2023 or the old one from 2006. I don't care. I love it. I was originally in love with the DB28 Digital. I found out it was too big. I was in love with the DB27 Polo. I found that basically, other than 3 prototypes, it doesn't exist. With the DBD, I found my dream Debatoon and the one that actually fits my wrist.
You know, I love your description of the tombstone style case, and it's well, I couldn't have said it better myself. I have to also add on to that, you know, borrowing a phrase from you, the torpedo style lugs at the 6 o'clock and the articulating lug at the 12 o'clock are very Debatoon. And again, to borrow what I was saying about the DB28 Grand Sport, it's very transitional Debatoon.
Yeah, I agree with that. You're seeing the last vestiges of the old DB1 case shape, and with the hinged lug up at the top, you're starting to see the first consideration of what a mobile variable geometry ergonomic lug might look like, where the lug itself actually contains a pivot rather than just a spring bar. And that was a very transitional time for them. They basically used the case shape from 2005's DBS, and once they started moving in that direction, they moved fast away from the DB1 chronograph form. But there's always something for everyone. The DB8 chronograph that came out, last year, again, that was a resurrection of that original DB1 case shape from the original DB8, which was basically a 45-minute mono counter version of the original DB1. So Debitoon stays in touch with their heritage. The DBD is just one of the weirdest threads of that heritage, and I love all versions of it. That would be on my list. Do you have a few more for us?
I do. I've got two more, actually.
Go for it.
Well, my last one's fun, so I'll save it. But I'd be remiss to not mention FP Journe, of course. I am a big fan of the brand in general. The FP Journe Black Label Chronometra Resonance. Resonance 2 Black Label on a bracelet would absolutely be a very, very towards the top of my list. It's the Black Label aspect, just aesthetically, the rarity on that is nice, but it doesn't really get my motor running as much as just the aesthetic in general. I like the asymmetry, and I love an FP Journe bracelet.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I think we have seen every Journe known to man here at the 1916 Company, so you speak from experience. You know what's out there, and you've made your choice.
Very lucky to have handled everything from pre-subscription FP Journes to astronomics, the very modern. So yes, and everything in between. And that is admittedly, it's almost a boring pick from the brand, but it's very simple and it's very specific.
Okay, I'm going to run through what I've got left here. IWC 3770. So this was the 1990 Grand Complication. Perpetual Calendar by Kurt Klaus. Minute Repeater by a pre-AP Renault Papi. And a 42mm platinum case. A true Grand Complication. Minute Repeater, Chronograph, and Perpetual Calendar with an aventurine moon phase. And specifically, I would want the platinum version with the black dial. There were rose gold versions over time. There were other variants, silver dials, white dials. I want black dial and platinum. And this is maybe around $100,000 these days. They're out there. They wouldn't make more than 50 per medal per year. But given that the model was in production for about 20 years before it became the Portugieser Perpetual Calendar, Portugieser Grand Complication, there's a decent amount of supply. I've seen the platinum white dial for as little as $80,000 with box and papers. So there are some buys out there. I like it for a couple of reasons. I really enjoy old school IWC design, and this has that. Hanno Bircher, who is probably their most prolific designer in the 1980s, did the design of this one. And unlike some of the weirder stuff he did for them in period, this is aged pretty well. The watch is wearable at 42 millimeters, so unlike a lot of modern Grand Complications, which are 44, 45, 46 millimeters, this is something that's big but wearable for me, and the feeling of solid platinum is monstrous. Although the movement is 7750 based, look, there's almost nothing left of the old Valjoux. A Valjoux has 25 joules. This has 75. So yeah, some changes were made. And it's got that brilliant Kurt Klaus mechanically programmed perpetual calendar system. So for me, this is a lovely piece of kinder, gentler, old school IWC. And I don't subscribe to the John Mayer school of everything modern from IWC being terrible. I think there are a lot of great one-off designs, and there have been some classics since the year 2000. It's just, I think, as a matter of course, a lot of the watches have been too big for me. And there's something endearing about the now quasi-vintage status of IWCs made in the 80s and 90s. So it's always difficult to compare modern watches to vintage. Vintage always has a leg up for emotional reasons, which is why I would never condemn modern IWC compared to the old stuff. I just say the old stuff has had time to become endearing, and the 3770 is a big piece of that.
That's a piece you've mentioned quite a few times, and I think I've brought it to the radar of more than a few people. I think long term that is going to be one of the most outrageous Grand Comps that has been in circulation. You know, your description of it, it's 42 millimeters yet wearable. It's platinum. It's going to be hefty. It's very classical looking. It has a legendary Klaus-based movement. It has I mean, IWC is a legendary repeater brand as well. So there's really a lot going on with that in that piece, and bang for your buck, truthfully, despite the fact that it is six figures. Now, I know, the amount of money that we're talking about, but for what you're getting, it is outrageous.
Yeah, it is a fantastic buy. And I guess I hold out hope for this because it's like on the upper borderline of what's possible if I plan and prioritize. So this is probably the watch on the list that I can other than the $2,000 ball, which obviously we could buy today. This is probably the long-term reach watch. I would need an incredible life milestone to go out and buy this for myself. I would want to commemorate something that's a real achievement. But yeah, that's on my radar in a way that's not hypothetical. More hypothetical, though, would be the Karsten Freysdorf 8. This is a version of his original spirograph tourbillon, and it's not often that somebody makes a marine chronometer tourbillon that you can beat and bash. The fact is, the watch is also highly customizable, and I got to wear one for the duration of Dubai Watch Week 2021, and he just let me keep it for a couple of days, and it's got a balance so big that this is the largest tourbillon carriage I've ever seen on a wristwatch. I've never seen a Kurbadon's Maximus, but this thing is monstrous. The amount of inertia is huge. It's not a wheel. It's a temperature-compensated dynamic marine chronometer-style balance in a tourbillon, and I swear if you stuck your finger in this thing, your finger would get cut off. It's that big.
So I do have one more, but can you talk a little bit about this kind of honeycomb pattern main plate?
Yeah, it's the idea of bees. I believe that Karsten works out of Le Chaux de Fonds, and bees are part of the local symbology, and I think they're on the town coat of arms. The honeycomb and the bee, iconic of Le Chaux de Fonds, and although he's a German, he practices there. It's his adopted home, so the honeycomb pattern on the watch is sort of a tribute to that.
I really, really like that aesthetic. It also makes for an interesting, you would call this the main plate of the watch, I suppose. It makes for an interesting main plate because I don't know, it seems like it's easy to, it's easy to machine.
Yeah, well, it's a pillar assembly. So there are pillars between the top plate and the bottom plate built like an old marine chronometer. And the thing is
interesting, okay,
not just built with a marine chronometer style balance, it's built with a full marine chronometer style architecture. And it's very, very pleasing. It is also incredibly loud. Again, I had it for a full Dubai Watch Week, so in my hotel room at night, I could hear it across the room.
The tourbillon is huge, or it's absolutely outrageously big. It's amazing. You know, I don't think I could have picked two watches to really describe, two final watches to describe the difference in our personalities, Tim, but it's a positive. So my final watch is the RM69 Erotic Tourbillon.
I've seen it.
It is so much fun. It is nothing but fun. There's nothing horologically significant about it other than the fact that it is fun.
Yeah, it puts the back in horology.
It certainly does. And you know, the erotic themes do have a place in horology from its inception, from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's been around forever. And, you know, it started with imagery on usually the case back of the watch, but then it grew to include automata, which was like an entirely different level of it. Usually it's something that's cloaked, like either in the watch or on the back of the watch, though in the modern era with Ulysse Nardin and then after their erotic automata, their Monera series of miniature painted enamel dials, they've kind of brought it to the forefront. The RM69 is a bit different because it has a recombinant set of tumblers that create various naughty phrases on the dial of the watch. It's almost a little bit like the old Gerard Perregaux vintage 1945 jackpot tourbillon, but instead of rolling like three spades, you get three words that combine to mean something dirty.
I want to caress you madly is perhaps the cleanest of the configurations.
Yeah, that's
of
the only one that's podcast safe. So guys, keep us streaming, open a different window, search for the RM69 erotic tourbillon. You can see exactly what Armand is talking about right now. We've got a bunch of windows open. None of this can be repeated. Okay, so now let's jump to our main topic, which is don't miss out. Watches to buy before prices go nuts. So the idea here is that we want to identify what is still a good buy. The worst thing on earth is realizing after the fact that you would have loved something that has now moved out of reach. This isn't about chasing likes on social media or making money so you can flip it. This is buying to keep and doing so before other people arbitrarily increase the price so you don't get frozen out. This is a collector's perspective on fear of missing out, not a market perspective on it. So Armand, why don't you lead off, because you are a trader. You actually transact with clients buying and selling. I don't do that, so I don't see as much that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have kind of two strong opinions on this. My first, I'll say, kind of coincides with what we think what I think the next trend will be. So I'll start out with saying asymmetrical case watches. So the pieces that have kind of already climbed to an interesting realm and a somewhat higher realm are the Albert Gilbert design Patek of the 50s and 60s. The asymmetry in the cases, kind of the post-deco, just very whimsical nature of them are remarkably interesting. They're very cool. They're, again, not horologically significant, but in a case design perspective, if we're talking design icon, they are significant. And I think asymmetrical cases from the big brands, from your Patek, the Vacheron Toledo, for example, like what you're pulling up, the Hamilton Ventura, pieces like that are interesting. They're fun. And I do think as style evolves and as modern timepieces, become kind of like the SUV and or crossover in terms of kind of resembling each other and becoming self-referential, I think the outlandish will stand out. And I think the really fun asymmetrical cases are going to be meaningful in the future.
Now, what I was looking for was to see if I could find any men's version of the Vacheron Constantin 1972 Prestige. This is a watch that was reissued in the modern era. Traditionally, it's been considered more of a ladies' watch, but strictly speaking, that's never been the rule. The modern incarnation of it, and it's best described as a trapezoid turned on its side so that the long side of the trapezoid is running top to bottom rather than side to side. The watch in the modern era has been powered by a caliber 1003, which is Geneva hallmark and solid gold, and incredibly rare. Very few people bought the modern Historique 1972 Prestige with that caliber 1003. And while it can be a little bit of a challenge to wear, it's also a watch that is extraordinarily uncommon, fine, and characteristic of what Vacheron does best. So among the asymmetrical cases, that one in particular, having been of recent production, as in the last 10 years, that's something to look for. I don't necessarily see that thing going crazy yet, but I can definitely see someday that watch being on the cover of an auction catalog when people realize how few of them were ever made and put into circulation.
I was just discussing that watch with a friend of mine, actually, and it's so funny that something like that doesn't come up twice in a week. That's
No, it's a very cool watch, and if you're into the idea of a solid gold movement, this is a neat one. A movement that's made of yellow gold, ultra thin and only 1.65 millimeters thick. The movement itself has historic value, and it's generally something you only see in very, very special watches. So that's one to look for. I do think that the most important watch of the modern era is probably the 2001 Ulysse Nardin Freak. We have so many different threads of design and engineering coinciding. We have a double direct impulse escapement. We have pervasive use of silicon in the watch. We have a dial side carousel tourbillon, which was at the time still fairly uncommon, but also the idea that most of the movement should be visible from the dial side. It predated all of these inverse and inside out and skeleton movements that allow you to see the action from the dial side, because the minute hand is also the caliber in baguette form. It used a design originally conceived by Carol Forestier-Casapi to have a movement that is inside of a circumferential mainspring. And so that was brought over with the double direct impulse escapement, the silicon technology, the carousel tourbillon idea, and along with Ludwig Oxlin and maybe Pierre Gigax, I think he was part of the team that created that. All of this came together, along with a feature that would become more and more common as time went on, which was the extended power reserve. In 7 days back in 2001, there was hardly anything like it. You'd have to go to the likes of maybe IWC to find a 7-day power reserve watch, or you would have to find a Blancpain tourbillon with an 8-day power reserve, or maybe one of the earliest Chopard Quattros. Like this was a really rare thing to have a week's worth of power reserve, a bezel for setting, a case back for winding. This was a watch that set so many different trends in terms of design and engineering that you should not be able to go back and buy it in its original form for under $35,000 today, especially considering they're all precious metal. That, to me, is the ultimate undervalued watch. Like, it's waiting for some definitive statement by a celebrity watch collector or an auction house or some sort of multi-volume feature from an author like, I don't know, maybe Mondane or maybe James Dowling or Jeff Hess. Someone's going to come forward and say, by the way, this watch is hiding in plain sight. And it really is. Not many freak knockoffs have been made by other brands, but if you try to tally the number of watches that have borrowed something from the freak, it would be a catalog of dozens, if not hundreds.
You know, you name a lot of great authors, but I just want to be here on the record and saying Tim Masso is saying this now, so that is not insignificant either, and I know you're humble.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I play to a small crowd. I think it's a bigger deal if John Goldberger says it. But if Oro Montanari cannot be brought to acknowledge the freak, at least here we are on the 1916 Company podcast declaring it the next big thing. Waco, don't ruin this for me. All right, so continuing down my list, I've got a watch that is quite scarce for the amount of awareness that exists. I don't think people realize how special the 1994 to 1998 first generation Omega Central Tourbillon was. Now, this watch was launched to mark 100 years since the debut of the Omega Caliber by the General Watch Company, and that eventually would lend its name to the company and it would become Omega. So it was an anniversary launch, and it was engineered primarily by Maurice Grimm, who'd previously done the 1986 Audemars Piguet Tourbillon Automatique, which is a breakthrough watch in its own right. And this Omega Tourbillon was straight up Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, at the time, Franck Muller territory, but by a brand best known for quartz dive watches and moon watches at the time. So it was something that really set Omega apart from its traditional rivals at Breitling and Rolex and put it on a plane with brands that otherwise would have no business competing with. Hand-finished, flying tourbillon, sapphire hour and minute hands, an automatic winding tourbillon, a crazy combination of a crown winder and a caseback setter. It was exceptional in every way. And people don't realize how few were made because the later examples would become almost common in mass production. People forget that less than 40 of the original series were made over 4 years by a workshop that only worked on these tourbillon.
It was also the world's first central tourbillon, is that correct?
I believe it was the first central tourbillon. Now, there might have been something like, I think there was a series called the Montre de Sable that were built as prototype pocket watches for Baselworld in the 80s. I'm not sure if any of them had centralized tourbillon, but I do know that there was a little bit of a lineage from one to the other in terms of design inspiration. I do think, though, that this was without a doubt the first central tourbillon wristwatch.
And I'm sorry, Omega Caliber that they were celebrating with the 100th anniversary, that was the first modular style movement, correct? That was assembly line ready, effectively.
You're talking about the one from 94?
Yes. No, the 100th, the anniversary they were celebrating.
In 1994? What anniversary are we talking about?
So you mentioned that was the 100th anniversary celebration of the Omega Caliber?
It was the 100th anniversary, yes, of the Omega Caliber that would soon lend its name to the brand itself.
Which was the first...
okay, I see what you're saying, yes.
My apologies, I worded it wrong.
No, I'm thinking like, pretty sure the original... the Caliber 1170, just to be clear for the guys out there, that is the movement that was in this original tourbillon. And there are a couple of different ways you can tell them. Obviously, if it's got box and papers, you'll know. But the Caliber 1170 was different from the later central tourbillons. Remember, these were automatic winding, and the rotor system was built into the caseback, so it was physically separate from the rest of the movement. It was geared to the movement, but not attached to the base plate in any way. So as the watch wound itself, it would create a ringing sound like a bell. So you can hear a ringing when you shake these watches, and that's a sign that it's a Caliber 1170. Also, there shouldn't be anything on the dial, so if it says coaxial or chronometer, that's not this watch. The earliest watches had unadorned dials. It was enough that they were flying tourbillons. That was pretty cool back then. It didn't need any of that other tinsel. So these were very clean designs, and at 38.7 millimeters, it's also a very wearable watch. Like, you can put this on your wrist and not feel like you're wearing an apartment block. It's the anti-Grubel 4C. All right, what do you got for me, Armand?
All right. So, we,
Oh, let me be price. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Prices are between about 40,000 and 55,000 for these. The market doesn't seem to distinguish between the earliest and rarest examples and the ones built from, for example, 1998 to 2006, when you did start to see all the, arrival of chronometer certifications and coax. So the fact that the early watches are priced the same as the latter is why I say this is a time to get on board.
good distinction there, definitely. And that's a really solid price point for a very interesting tourbillon.
And historically important. And Omega will take care of you. You don't have to worry about some, flaky independent watchmaker not providing parts and service. Omega will always take care of those watches.
So moving to the next, I talk about the Master of Complications a decent amount, but I do think Franck Muller, a fun complication Franck Muller of the late 80s or late 90s and early 2000s are going to be sought after. I look at these pieces, I look at whimsical complications, fun tourbillons, roulette wheel complications, crazy hours, things like that, and it does excite me. I don't own a Franck Muller personally, but these are complications that are fun, are interesting, and I do think kind of speaking a little bit to our early point, the tonneau case shape is interesting to a lot of people. It wears easily, it wears well, and it kind of conforms to the wrist in a really, really nice way, as long as it doesn't get too big.
I would say that the most collectible Franck Muller pieces are going to be 1990s models that were world premiere complications, or examples that were built with historically significant new old stock movements. And there were quite a few of these. In general, just look for those. Look for those two things. Look for new old stock chronograph calibers, minute repeaters. Look for some of the pieces that were ultra complicated, because those were generally executed by fairly insurable master watchmakers who were brought in from the outside to design them. And because Franck Muller is a fairly large company today, there's still money and the know-how to service that stuff. And the people who work at Franck Muller servicing those high complications, Ludovic Ballois, for example, was one of those people for 3 years. Those are incredible watchmakers, and they will take care of you. Again, nice to know that there is a solvent, well-established company behind those old 90s pieces, because if you want to go out and, say, get a non-functional a la Silberstein tourbillon running, you've got quite a hunt for parts and then applicable expertise to make that happen. That's going to be tough. So yeah, good choice, both because the company is still around and because the watches are significant. Okay, so I'm also going to say this. A really good example of a watch that's undervalued is the 2020 Patek Philippe 6007A. So if you're familiar with this watch, it was a 1,000-piece steel limited edition to mark the arrival of a new manufacturer building. So it came a year after that, in 2020. It was steel. It was a 1,000-piece edition. And this is important because it laid down the groundwork for the watch that came out just last year, the 6007G. And that watch is available in unlimited production. So steel Patek Philippe is always highly collectible. And when there's a firm and hard stop on the production run after 1 year, 1,000 pieces, you have the makings of a collectible already. But take a look at what's happening with the 6007G right now, which again is available in unlimited quantities. They sell new for $38,060. Pre-owned, you will see them everywhere from about $45,000 to about $60,000, which means a watch whose production is open-ended and still available from the manufacturer is costing more pre-owned in some cases than a steel 1,000-piece edition that has been defunct for 3 model years. Go out and get yourself a 6007A because they're not making any more. The combination of steel, Patek Philippe limited edition, discontinued, and a blue dial, a really nice slate blue dial that's going to age well, that makes this a surefire collectible. And, I think the fact that you can still go out and find this watch for $55,000 to $60,000, it's a good value. Would I pay a lot more than that? I probably wouldn't pay more than $70,000 for it, but I also think in the future it's going to be regarded the way extraordinary Patek Philippe watches are regarded. Just look at the escalation in the value of the 40th anniversary Nautilus and Nautilus chronograph from 2016, and you can see how quickly the market becomes aware of limited editions from Patek Philippe. Again, this is a watch that is not cheap by any means, but prices in the 50s are available, and right now we're seeing prices from the 40s to 70s for the white gold 6007. I think the one to get is the one you can't buy new anymore. So I think that's a cool piece. Plus, it's a steel Calatrava. It's not like I'm telling you to go out and buy the Patek Philippe sculpture or something that's hugely controversial and divisive. So, this is a watch that's got everything going for it aesthetically, which we all know is as important as any other factor. I got one for you guys at home. I think the Freak is by far the best call on my list because I think it's the one that, more than any of the others, has exhausted its obscurity. Like, I think its time is coming, especially with the revitalization of the brand and their emphasis on the Freak as their core model. I think you're going to see a lot more awareness here. And just as, for example, we saw Roger Dubuis perpetual calendar chronographs from the 90s go from being $15,000 watches in 2015 to multiples of that today, I think the obscurity and underrated qualities of the Freak are going to be exhausted very soon. That said, Holy Trinity has a special allure to it. And I think there's a watch that a lot of people don't know about that should get more recognition than it does and may soon. And that is the Vacheron Constantin 49005. So this came out in 1992. And it's about a 38 millimeter diameter watch. They made 500 pieces in rose gold and 300 pieces in platinum, maybe less. And oddly, for Vacheron's first series production, perpetual calendar chronograph, it was an automatic watch using a Frédéric Piguet base. So a high horology base and a high horology watch, perpetual calendar chronograph from Vacheron. The number that have survived in good shape with their original boxed set is incredibly low. Again, 500 in rose gold, 300 in platinum, and just so underrated that it skirts by, or, it basically escapes collector embrace because so many don't know it exists. But 1990s Vacheron may soon become as cool as 1990s IWC. Watches like this, the Mercator, the Saltarello, are going to have their time in the sun because they're different, they're rare, they're emblematic of what Vacheron does so well. Despite being the supposedly stuffy and conservative brand, Vacheron often does the stuff that's most adventurous and offbeat. If you find one in good shape, full set today, do not hesitate. These things are not expensive for what they are. You'll be able to get one in platinum in the 50s. You'll be able to get one in colored gold in the high 30s, low 40s, and that's a hell of a lot of value.
And when something like a 5270 is well into the 100,000s, whether it's gold or platinum, this does look really, really outrageously nice. It's also, this is also case in point where if Vacheron looked back into their catalog and really paid attention to what they have produced in the past, they could have a fantastic line today. This watch could be produced today with maybe just small updates such as slightly thicker lugs, just something very small. But other than that, you could almost do a shoot-for-shoot remake, so to speak.
And because I mentioned the Saltarello, let it be said that this jump hour retrograde with Geneva Hallmark caliber 1120 is still kicking around in the low $30,000 range. So the Saltarello, some people say it looks like a bathroom scale. Get over yourself, dude. This is one of the most beautiful watches of its era. It's thin, fine, gorgeous with a real rose lathe guilloche dial, Geneva Hallmark movement, a retrograde hand, and a jump hour, and a profile that is razor thin plus limited edition status. Go out and get one in white gold. Go out and get one in colored gold. Go out and get one that hasn't been polished above all. And you're going to have an incredible prospect for the future that will someday be so far out of the price range of that $30,000 watch guy, he'll wish he went out and bought two. Guys, thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast. Keep those questions coming. Again, if your queries are about watches, we have answers. So that is podcasts at the1916company.com. Until then, I am Tim. He is Armand, signing off.